Good afternoon. I am Brian Hawkins, Senior Director of External Affairs at People United for Privacy. Today, joining us is Craig Trainor, Senior Special Counsel with the U.S. House of Representatives, Committee on the Judiciary, and the Select Subcommittee on Weaponization of the Federal Government. On the Weaponization Subcommittee, Craig and his colleagues, under the direction of Chairman Jim Jordan, have investigated how government agencies have abused their powers to harass, surveil, and intimidate conservatives. The Select Subcommittee has uncovered how the FBI targeted perceived conservative Catholic Americans as, quote, sources for potential domestic terrorism, end quote. The subcommittee has exposed the dubious IRS practice of unannounced field visits to the private homes of American taxpayers, and how this harm would have been compounded with the Biden administration's planned hiring of 87,000 new IRS agents. The subcommittee opened an investigation into the Department of Justice's lenient prosecution of a Department of Treasury contractor convicted of leaking the confidential tax returns of prominent individuals, including former President Donald Trump. These findings, which are available on the House Judiciary Committee's website, reveal a disturbing pattern of government agencies weaponizing their authority to silence and, in some cases, smear perceived political and policy opponents. Craig has had a long career in the law. He's been with Chairman Jordan's staff since February 2023, and before that, he served as Senior Litigation Counsel with the America First Policy Institute. A native New Yorker, Craig was also a member of the New York Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and his writing on the intersection of law, policy, and culture has appeared in the New York Post, National Review, City Journal, Quillette, and the American Conservative, among other publications. Today, Craig will share his views on the weaponization of government and what unchecked weaponization can mean for nonprofit donor privacy. But a few housekeeping notes. While Craig is employed by Congress, he is speaking today solely on his personal capacity and will discuss only publicly available information, in addition to his own personal assessments of the weaponization threat. Second, if you have any questions, you can place them in the chat box and we will get to them towards the end of the session if there is time. So with that, Craig, thank you very much for joining us. And I think everyone's in a treat with him because he's a true happy warrior. Craig is one of those people who truly believes that not only do we have an obligation to save this country, but we will save this country. And so I'm really excited to have him with us. So thank you, Craig.
First off, thank you for having me, Brian. So I appreciate being here. Of course, I'm a fan of the important work that the People United for Privacy do for the American people every day.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Craig, tell us about the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. How did it come about and what necessitated its formation?
So before I answer your question, Brian, let me reiterate what you alluded to moments ago. I am not here speaking on behalf of the House Judiciary Committee, the Weaponization Subcommittee, or Chairman Jordan, nor will I be disclosing any non-public committee information or deliberations. I appear here solely in my personal capacity. Now, to answer your question, the problem that prompted the formation of the Select Subcommittee is in the name. The American people really began to see something changed in federal law enforcement and in their interactions with the federal government after the election of President Trump, or around what I call the Trump era, when he began to sort of become a candidate for president in 2016. We all know about the Russian collusion myth, how that was predicated on Clinton campaign opposition research that was itself a fiction. People began to pay attention during during that time when they saw people like James Comey, Andrew McCabe, and other senior FBI officials appear to be laying the groundwork for something more nefarious against the Republican nominee for president and then the eventual president. And they asked, what's going on? And their elected officials had the same questions. Then around 2021, 2022, an avalanche of FBI whistleblowers began disclosing to Republican members of Congress all types of civil liberties violations. For instance, in the FBI, whistleblowers disclosed that the FBI created a threat tag for parents voicing their concerns at school board meetings, against oppressive COVID-19 policies, indoctrination efforts, or biological boys using the girls' bathrooms. And to be clear, the threat tags suggest these parents are essentially potential terrorists, or in the post-Obama administration speak, I think the term is domestic violent extremist. We whistleblowers disclosed that the FBI leadership was pushing out FBI employees for attending conservative political events. Rank and file pressure was being applied to agents to reclassify cases as domestic violent extremism to hit self-created performance metrics. Infamously, the FBI, some in the FBI viewed the Betsy Ross flag as a terrorist symbol. A couple more anecdotes just to give you a sense of how, in some ways, rampant this was. The FBI's Washington field office was deliberately manipulating January 6 case files to make it appear that there was a rise in domestic violent extremism across the nation, notwithstanding that they were looking at an incident that lasted a number of hours on a specific day. And then ultimately, the FBI was accepting private user information from Facebook without the user's consent. And this information appeared to come largely, if not only, from the so-called conservative side of the political spectrum. So this was only a sample of what whistleblowers were revealing to Republican members of the House. And I think the through line, Brian, is that, and the reason for the formation of the committee is ultimately the FBI was applying a double standard, and it was targeting First Amendment activity of Americans who were perceived as politically conservative. I can go on, but I know, as your viewers understand, I should make this point. The problem is not limited to the FBI or the DOJ. You'll recall the Department of Homeland Security had set up a, quote, disinformation governance board to be led by this sort of cringy left-wing censor who was going to mediate what is and is not true for the American people. I mean, what could go wrong? And of course, you had the Biden administration really at the highest levels coercing social media platforms to censor speech under the guise of harmful disinformation that for some reason only affected conservatives or really anyone else who disagreed with the regime's line on COVID-19 or any other sensitive topics. So taken together, Brian, what the American people saw with their own eyes was a manifest double standard at work. In other words, weaponized government. So Mr. Jordan led the charge along with other members of the House Freedom Caucus and with then Speaker McCarthy's backing to create the Select Subcommittee with full subpoena power to engage in the critical work of oversight of the FBI, the DOJ, the intelligence community, and the permanent government generally, where civil rights and liberties were implicated. So that was a long answer, but I think it's important to flesh out why this is such a necessary Select Subcommittee in this Congress.
No, I appreciate you starting long because we're going to dig into it as we go into it. So like that opening was a really good setting the table for us and actually a little terrifying. So you mentioned FBI, DHS, DOJ broadly. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys have found from the IRS?
Sure. So, IRS primary oversight is Ways and Means, but obviously there's a judiciary and certainly a weaponization component because we deal with all civil liberties violations. The IRS, I don't have to tell your members, Brian, has a long and dubious history of weaponizing its authority. Some will recall that in the late 1990s, the Senate Finance Committee held oversight hearings to investigate the IRS, and I'm quoting, Gestapo-like, end quote, conduct against taxpayers. As a result of these hearings and the evidence that was ultimately received in the Senate, Congress passed the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998 to put limits on the IRS's enforcement powers and to rein in, quote, a tax agency out of control, end quote. But alas, in 2013, during the Obama administration, the IRS targeted dozens of conservative nonprofits seeking tax-exempt status by subjecting the nonprofits to, quote, heightened scrutiny and inordinate delays, end quote. Congress investigated the scandal and several top IRS officials resigned in disgrace, Lois Lerner being the most prominent name and face of this conduct. We began looking at the practice of IRS unannounced field visits. That's what we looked at this Congress, and we have a finding and a report on that. In our investigation, we learned that for decades, the IRS had authorized its officers to appear at taxpayers' homes or businesses without prior notice to collect, presumably to collect on delinquent tax bills. Now, we were told by the IRS that these unannounced field visits traditionally have been reserved for rare cases in which taxpayers or businesses had been unresponsive to prior IRS communications. The numbers will surprise you, however, or perhaps not, depending on how sort of jaded, cynical one is. They were shocking to me. We learned that in each year, the IRS was making tens of thousands of unannounced visits to homes and businesses. And they were not merely doing this in exceptional cases, mind you, as the policy was designed. Ordinary Americans found themselves in the IRS's crosshairs. And the IRS was frequently doing these unannounced visits without attempting to first contact the taxpayer by other less intrusive means. As a result of the Judiciary Committees and the Weaponization Subcommittee's oversight work, the IRS discontinued this decades-long practice once we brought the disinfectant of sunlight. Now, this is critical as well. Before we uncovered these IRS patterns and practices, Democrats in Congress flooded the IRS with $78.9 billion in new funding in 2022, $45 billion of which was earmarked solely for tax enforcement purposes, which would have presumptively dramatically increased the sort of terrifying for some interactions when somebody knocks out the door. And as Ronald Reagan said, the most terrifying words in America are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Democrats chose to enable the IRS to hire as many as 87,000 agents to pursue American taxpayers. And one of the first priorities of the Republican majority in the 118th Congress was to severely curtail that funding. And our investigation into the IRS's unannounced home and business visits showed the wisdom of this defunding, as it were.
Now, tell me about this was a story written a few months ago, maybe a year ago at this point. Matt Taibbi, he testified at your subcommittee, and on the same day the IRS sent agents to his house. Is that right? Tell me more.
That is correct. That's pretty remarkable. It's not very subtle either. I like to call it the curious case of Matt Taibbi. So Matt Taibbi exposed something called the Twitter files. And that is essentially a documentation of sort of government abuse that was happening and in collusion with large social media companies. And Matt Taibbi was invited to testify at the Select Subcommittee. And Matt Taibbi did, in fact, testify at the Select Subcommittee. And as I mentioned, he had been reporting on the Twitter files, which, among other things, exposed the way Twitter employees were censoring accurate information on issues of national political interest, such as the infamous Hunter Biden laptop story. So the Select Subcommittee invited Mr. Taibbi to testify as to his Twitter files findings and related matters. And wouldn't you know it, Brian, the IRS made an unannounced field visit to his home on the same day he testified before our subcommittee about government overreach and abuses. So coincidences are very real. Draw your own inferences, but Mr. Taibbi seems to think that this was an attempt by the federal government to chill his reporting about its excess and abuse. And perhaps bolstering this point, this is important, it turns out he did not owe the IRS one red cent. The IRS ended up owing him a substantial refund.
Wow.
So let me sort of tie this in, if I can, to donor privacy. That's the interest of your organization among its patriotic concern about weaponization. As for sort of weaponization's impact on donor privacy, it's sort of axiomatic that donors have a legitimate privacy concern. And the disclosure of donors' identities will or may, in some instances, will reduce charitable giving and political participation. Donor identity is not relevant to whether nonprofits, for instance, are complying with the law or effectuating their tax-exempt purposes. The fear that a donor's identity might be compromised, whether by a rogue IRS consultant leaking their information, as was done to President Trump and other prominent Americans, Elon Musk, among others, or by a disreputable IRS agent who's informing his or her team to slow roll exempt applications, it is especially acute, the fear, when there is evidence that it has happened or is happening. And what I like to say is, if you sort of look at I hate to be someone who only has a hammer and everything's a nail, but I'm a lawyer, and First Amendment activity is a big part of the work that we're doing. I like to look at the analogous principle of associational privacy. In 1958, the Supreme Court first recognized, in a case called NAACP v. Alabama, that the First Amendment protected the NAACP's right to keep its members list private and free from public disclosure. The court understood that compelling the NAACP to disclose its members' identity would hamper the organization's ability to advocate for its cause, which will not surprise you, Brian, and people watching, was not very popular in Jim Crow, Alabama, as well as cause current members to quit and discourage new members from joining when faced with potential exposure, in that case, very serious consequences. So driving home the point, the court wrote that, quoting, "The inviolability of privacy in group association may, in many circumstances, be indispensable to preservation of freedom of association, particularly where a group espouses dissident beliefs." So I think we live in a deeply polarized country in which cancel culture is a very real thing, among other pathologies in American life today. So donor privacy remains essential, and weaponization, which again seems to only go in one direction, presents real challenges to individual donors who have to worry about being caught in the political crossfires, as it were.
Yeah. So wow, that's awesome. You mentioned earlier the IRS and Lois Lerner, and how Chairman Jordan, he also led the investigation into the Lois Lerner IRS scandal. But one of the things that came out of that investigation is how the IRS began to target these Tea Party groups at the time. And what actually happened was another familiar name, Jack Smith, who is now the special prosecutor, and I know this might be outside your wheelhouse, so I'll take moderator's discretion here. But Jack Smith, who is now the special prosecutor on some of the January 6 cases that you mentioned against President Trump, he at the time, around 2010, 2011, was with the DOJ Public Integrity Section, and he saw this New York Times report about all these conservative nonprofits, Tea Party groups, and their donors. He actually went to FBI and said, "Hey, you guys should investigate this." And the FBI was like, "Hey, we're not interested in it." So he went to the IRS instead, and Lois Lerner picked it up. And that's when she started to investigate and scrutinize these conservative groups, which, as you noted, just revealed all types of impropriety on behalf of the IRS. But I think it, again, really illustrates the point of this weaponized government against political opponents, and how they all operate in sync. It's not necessarily these, and forgive me in advance, maybe I'm getting a little bit conspiratorial here, but it's not, sometimes it is independent actors, but also it's all these actors acting together. And maybe if one agency can't get it, then another agency can be used to target a political opponent or smear a political opponent. So all that to say, between the Lois Lerner IRS scandal and everything that you've been finding on the Weaponization Committee, what are some common themes that you're finding about how government is weaponized against the American people, particularly conservatives?
I think that is the common theme, Brian. I think, in my assessment, the common theme is this seems to only happen in conservatives, conservative nonprofits, conservative individuals, conservative Catholics, conservative presidential nominees, conservative presidents, and to those unlucky enough to call it out for what it is. So I do think the common theme is that, and this is a sort of larger question, perhaps beyond our remit, but what is it about those who are in the permanent government, career people, who just invariably find themselves drawn to weaponizing their authority and not applying the values of what I like to call the values of equal protection, which never put aside the sort of equal protection principle. Is the fundamental theory is simply that you will treat all people equally.
Yeah.
We are all God's children. We have all equal value, whether or not we disagree with each other. And we are all entitled to the protections of the law without regard to persons, race, color, religion, sex, you name it. And what is it about those in the permanent government, the administrative state, that they find ways, along with other actors, to target conservatives? And I think when you look at the evidence, it is not. Let me be clear about this, because conservative, church-going Catholics or anyone else is out committing, is
Yeah.
providing predication for a justifiable investigation. There's something else more nefarious going on, and that's what this weaponization subcommittee exists to expose and correct.
What do you think it means for conservative nonprofits such as People United for Privacy or any other nonprofit out there who is advocating for constitutional rights, individual liberty, free markets? What does it mean for us to know that when we submit our 990 form to the government or file any other document with the government and interact with any of these government agencies, what does it mean for us in the entire conservative nonprofit ecosystem to know that this government views us with distrust and as, once again, domestic terrorists, and that they can weaponize their powers against us? Like, how should we kind of deal with that, or just approach that?
Let
I
me
know it's a
answer.
loaded question.
Yeah, well, that's not something I'm unfamiliar with where I work. Look, let me take issue in part with part of the premise, Brian. Just to be clear, and I'm not, again, in part or perhaps an inference, we're not doing, and you're not saying, we're not doing advocacy just for conservative groups. As Mr. Jordan said when he took to the floor of the House in January of 2023 to defend the formation of the Select Subcommittee from partisan attack, we don't want to go after anyone. We just want it to stop.
Yeah.
So I think all nonprofits ideally will rest better knowing that the committee and our conference is working night and day to defend the First Amendment activities of all Americans. But that is sort of the end game. That is the principle. Now there's the practical reality, which I think is what your question speaks to, is it seems to be only conservatives that have to worry about this thing. The most important thing, in my personal judgment, is we have to keep going on, and we cannot let, and this is perhaps easier said, we cannot let the fact that there are those, call it the regime or in the permanent government, that are very powerful actors who are just, whatever their professional obligations, they view it in part as extra scrutiny for conservatives, or sticking it to conservatives, whatever's going. I don't begin to try to get in their minds. I just know what's happened. Is that we don't shy away from the fight. I think one thing, certainly, I think one thing Jordan has demonstrated, House Republicans have demonstrated, is that this is not going to stop on its own. So we're going to expose it, and we're going to try to get accountability wherever we can get it. So I think ultimately, we live in a republic, and the American people decide who their leaders are. And I think the question for the American people, for conservatives, but also the American people, is how do we want our regime to be governed? Do we want people who presume to act in our names, and that's what every public servant does who works in the federal government, to be targeting half of the country? Or do we, so I would say, or do we want leaders who are going to ensure that it's a priority to ensure that people who work for the government do not violate their oath, and in fact do equal justice and equal right by every American? And the most important thing is groups like yours and others is to get out there and continue the fight, because I think you, like me, and certainly like the Republican majority in Congress, is we want all Americans to have equal right done by them. We want all to entertain. We want all to be able to go into First Amendment activities without fear that we're going to have reprisal by the federal government, whether that's the FBI, the DOJ at large, the IRS, whatever mechanisms of the state that can be used by those who mean partisan harm to those who just, have the grave offense of disagreeing with them. We want to ensure that everyone out there knows the stakes. It's not a time to shy away. Now is the time to really make it happen, and whatever that looks like. But it can't continue. Not if the greatest experiment in history, the United States of America, is going to continue as a constitutional republic. It cannot continue this way.
That, and what we like to say is transparency is for the government, privacy is for the people. So through the Weaponization Subcommittee, you guys have shown a bright light on what the government is doing. You have brought transparency to their actions, and that alone has brought tremendous results, like you mentioned, with the defunding of the 87,000 agents, the cessation of the unannounced house visits, field visits. So I think it just really illustrates the point of transparency is for the government, privacy is for the people, and I think that's the core principle we need to uphold here. So, Craig, thank you very much for your time. This has been awesome. I do have one more question though before we close this out. As I mentioned in your bio, you're a New Yorker, and as many of our audience knows, I am a proud Angelino Dodgers fan. So, Dodgers in 4 sweep do you agree with that? How are you feeling?
No, let's use the analogy of this discussion. Just as weaponization goes in one way, the sweep only goes in one way. The New York Yankees will be sweeping the Dodgers, who, I would remind you, initially started out in Brooklyn, which is my hometown. So we're not going to hold that against them for purposes of this series.
It's going to be a fun series. Craig, thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone in our audience, thank you for joining us too. We just want to remind you all, just kind of some closing thoughts of this webinar is that, like we mentioned at the end, transparency is for government, privacy is for the people. And what Craig has demonstrated here is an organized effort of government bureaucrats to weaponize their powers against conservatives. And that includes the IRS, Department of Treasury, groups that have lots of regulatory authority over nonprofit organizations. And we should really remain skeptical and vigilant against granting those type of agencies power, because those powers will ultimately be used against us. So this is why we fight so hard for donor privacy, to keep our right to effectively advocate for the causes we believe in. Craig, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Brian.